Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series of videos working effectively with Conformiq Creator, where we tell you all kinds of tips and tricks on how to work effectively with our Conformiq Creator client. My name is Stefan Schulz. I'm the CTO and product owner of Conformiq Creator. Please note this video is not intended to show you how to model necessarily a specific your application, but it's intended to mainly focus you on concepts and tool features that you may have not been aware of. And as this is a video on an advanced topic, it holds even more that you should have a good basic understanding of using Conformiq Creator before you watch this video. So for example, you should have attended and passed our online Conformiq Green Belt training. So in this fifth part, we will now introduce you how to model effectively tables in applications with graphical user interfaces. So web applications, desktop applications, you name it. Okay, so what we're going to go through, we're going to talk about UI tables, which is actually a topic that has been intentionally excluded from the Greenbelt training because it's an advanced topic. So firstly, we're going to check how that looks like in a real application, and then we're going to talk about that this is how we address it in modeling. And in the modeling, we're going to look first at simple data tables and go through multiple levels. So first, like, how do you define this? How do you do a simple kind of content verification? And then we get more advanced by saying, like, okay, now I want to click something in the table and verify dynamic content. Yes, and finally, we're going to discuss a little bit of also topics about what happens when you don't have the action you're looking for. And this we have also discussed in the previous session already. I hope you've watched that video on custom actions, because that's also what we're going to talk about in the last part. Okay, so let's get started. So one of the standard applications we're often working with, for example, is this application. So here you see I've already populated my data table by adding here via the form these items. So I want to buy, CQ003 quantity of 5, and 10 times CQ001. This table changes. I can actually remove things and I can add them back if I want, and then I can check out. So the trick is, how can I model this, and exactly what am I interested in modeling? Of course, I could verify anything I want, but usually we should try to stick in what's important, right? So in the first time, we're going to focus on, like, whatever I enter, I want to see in the table. So probably description does not really matter to me because it changes quite a lot, or even unit price, not very interesting, right? So we're going to talk about how to abstract it, this modeling of this table. And then in the second part, we're going to talk about a little bit more fun tables. So when things do stuff like this, you have collapsing rows, you have radio buttons within this that you can click. The sky's the limit on complex data tables. This is beyond what we can do with the UI data table. With the UI table in Conformiq Creator, and we're going to discuss how to handle that. Okay, and then finally, I just want to point out that actually, working with tables actually is part of our standard web application, and you should have seen it by looking at this first very simple example, simple web application, which is essentially based on this website that I've just been showing you. So here you can, for example, see that, yes, we are verifying content, dynamic content here. We're adding dynamically content to the UI table, and we're clicking a button in a UI table. So, I mean, there's actually, technically speaking, everything is there, but the big question is what's behind this, right? And that's what we're going to talk about in this video. Okay, let's move on. All right, how to model simple data tables. So in the beginning, there was the definition, right? So before we can do anything in our AD, we need to kind of do something in our SD, the structure diagram. Right now, I've just copied the main thing, which is the form with the buttons. And now the question is, well, how would I model the table, which is in the top of that screen? So what I'm talking about is essentially in this application, these two rows, which is the simple, like HTML-like looking table. All right, so let me go to it. So basically, there's two concepts you need to understand. One is the UI table, this one. Right, so you can drag and drop it from either there or the other toolbars. So this is what you really see on the screen, right? So, for example, this would be your shopping cart. Right. Okay. And then as you can see, it has a relation to another concept called a data table, which is this table object with a green bar, which actually represents the data stored in the table, right? Now, in a real system, that's usually a database, not a data table necessarily, but I mean, you can think of it like a database. So that's called, this is the items that are in my basket, right? And this is actually modeled separately from the UI table. And then we create a relation, for example, either select it over here, or actually this creates automatically an arrow for me, or I just drag out the arrow and connect it. So now when I save that, it says that's all good and fine, but you should tell me what's actually in this table. So here I have the choice for two different fields. So the SKU, which is string, which is the data that I'm entering here. And then the data I'm entering here is actually numbers, so I will say quantity is the column, and that contains numbers. So right now that's a string by default, so I need to change it by number to number. Okay, and that already lets me have my first definition, right? So now with this I can already do stuff. So I can, for example, verify data is appearing in a table, right? I cannot, well, actually by default also we get some more actions from this, but yeah, so for example, we get the select the rows in a data table, but we'll talk about that in a moment. So right now what happens is that I can do some examples. So for example, I can say, all right, let's fill this item form, and let's click the add item button, and then we want to verify that it's been added. So this is how I would go about it. So let's just add something here. This was the wrong choice. So CQ001 for the identifier, and then I want to say 10 times. Okay, so 10 times CQ001, and then I click the button, and then I want to see that that data is in the data table, so that it is contained. And actually, this is a critical thing about modeling. Okay, firstly here, in order to say that, we need to select this value, and then you basically see that the UI table is there. And by default, it's pointing to the data table current dynamic contents, but as a start, we will statically define the content. So we will say there is an item. This one, there is an item in the table, SKU with quantity, and that should be in the table. Now, it could have 100 other rows, but that's the only row that I care of. So I should never model all the 100 rows that are in there. I should just pick the subset of rows that actually I'm interested in. So I can do this multiple ways. So for example, I can actually, instead of hard coding, I should actually say whatever I've entered I want to see, right? So for example, I say, like this. So I want to actually enter the SKU, sorry, I want to verify that the SKU that was entered in this action is actually shown in the screen. And this is good because maybe one day I want to change my data, and then I don't need to go to 10 places in the model to update that, right? So now I've linked the fields. You should know about this. So now basically I'm checking, there should be a row that has CQ001, and I don't care about the quantity. If the quantity matters, I do the same trick, right? I go to pick the field, and I say, pick it from that action before. So with that, we have a model that we can load and generate test cases. And basically, what we see then is that, give it one moment, that when we go to the test review perspective, we can generate test cases. Okay. Test review. So in the test review, we basically see here now that we're checking that, you know, a bunch of stuff, but we're checking that the UI table entry is the same that we entered, right? So first step, we fill it, and then the tool has computed that it's the same data. So far, so good. So now let's say, that's great, but Stefan, actually, I want to click the remove item button now in this. And let's just recall this. This is the remove item where it says well, actually that item does not exist right now, remove all the buttons, right? So let's just add it here real quick. So I have now this. So right now I've written basically what I've just done. I've said like add the CQ01, make sure that it's in the table contained. So my test should pass now in the execution. It doesn't matter how many items I have there. Now I want to remove it, click the remove all button, and now it gets a little bit more complicated. So firstly, clicking the button is actually quite easy. I need to update my structure diagram, and I need to say there's a button. Now, where you add the button, this is maybe a little bit counterintuitive. You actually add it here. That means any links or whatever, if you have any clickable item in your UI table, that's what you need to basically put in here in the UI table, and the data table only has the data. Okay, so now if you save this, basically now you will get an additional option, which is in the shopping table. So in the main screen, in the shopping table, you can click the remove item button. So this is fine. So now we get again to this interesting part. So when we want to click a button, we actually need to say where we want to click it, right? So we're getting back to this thing that, well, whatever I've added before in here, this is what I should add, right? So row selection criteria, I'm going to just say it very simply. Don't care clicks anywhere in the table, right? It does not care anything. So now again, I could hard code it, or I could go back and say, well, whatever I've entered earlier in my item form, this is exactly what I want to remove. And this will basically, in this application, there can only be one row with CQ001, and that's enough, right? So then I'm clicking the row. But now what you will see is, even if I try to generate test cases, I'm going to have this funny problem that's going to say no tests will be generated. And the issue is that in order to work with any kind of input action, so see this, there's no test generated. And the thing is, it was not able to click the button, and this has actually, the reason why this happens, because our data table is not actually really initialized. It is, we have only done a custom check here, so this is actually not good enough. What we actually need to do is we need to formally add, excuse me, an action where we have here data table action, where we're saying like, for example, after I fill out the form, basically the system itself, right, adds this data that I've just added into the system. So I'm back to what I've been trying to model before, that I'm saying, the SKU item from the fill form action. And now I need to be explicit. I need to really fill all the data in. This is something about the about this table add action. So basically, this is considered an internal action. You will not see this in the generated test. Any performance on the data table data that we're manipulating will never go to the test case. It will just be, but you need to model it anyway. So now I say the user enters the data, the system adds an entry into the data. Well, actually, the correct piece is obviously only after I add the button. Okay, let me put it here. So then you can actually see it in the screen. And now here's an alternative. Here we have hard-coded the data still, in a way. But what I can also do is I can say clear and use my default option, excuse me, which is contents of the item data table. So now I have modeled the same verification in a different way, that I'm actually saying whatever is currently in my data table, I'm verifying. And what is in there? Well, whatever I've added, which is whatever I filled out in the form. So now I've been using dynamic data modeling, right? So static data modeling, you hard code it into the custom action content, but then you cannot click buttons or select rows. And when you want to click a button, you need to dynamically add the data, right? So yes, so let's take a look what happens. So now when I go and generate tests, we will see that all of a sudden, well, this test will actually still be invalid because we're now going to click the button, but finally we're going to start generating tests again. Now we're covering everything because it has found the row where you were supposed to click, right? So now if you go to the test review, if we look at our test, now you see still, this is still verifying the correct thing that was added is actually visible, because now I'm checking just my internal data table connects, and you see the add item, the data table entry, this action here is actually nowhere visible externally, right? And that's by intent, because it's an internal operation, right? And then we're actually clicking the data table entry as in the model. Okay, so this kind of, and the same thing, the same constraint about clicking is when you, for example, want to select a row, there's a very similar operation like clicking a button. So in here it's the same thing. You need to specify selection criteria, right? So for example, like the data item that you want to actually click. So here right now I want to select the row where the SKU is whatever I filled in the form, and I don't care which quantity. So now, and by the way, this may select multiple rows. So for example, let me do this differently. Let's just set this back to don't care. So let's say I want to select all the rows where the quantity is 5. This now would model that way, because SKU don't care. If you fix it, it will be a very specific row. But if you say actually 5 and don't care, it means like any row where it's 5. So selecting a row is actually select rows which will be 1 or more. And the same thing, if there's no data in your data table, you will get 0 test cases, right? You always need to remember that. Okay, so that basically finishes our introduction to dynamic data handling. These are basically all the actions and types of actions that you have. Remember, you should specify selection criteria whenever you're clicking buttons on a table or that. And now the final thing is, well, how do I do some other stuff? So sometimes I get people asking me absence of a row, right? So how can I make sure now after I click remove that this row is really gone? So you can, of course, check that all the other rows are still there, but it doesn't mean that the row is gone. So this is, again, a point where we need to use custom actions. And for that, I want to refer to our previous video to define these extra actions that you may want to perform even on a simple table, like verifying the absence. So again, I would have to say in which table, which column name, and what should be the cell value of that column name, which I want to say that this is not there. Or I may need to go through and actually have multiple columns where I specify data. Then I would have to have more parameters in this custom data, custom action. Again, custom actions is something that only experts should be specifying. So contact your expert in your team to have a review of the action that you want to add, but you should not be adding any of the actions that you already have, like selecting a row or clicking a button in a simple table. So this now takes us to the last section here about complex tables and search results. Again, here abstraction is number 1. We're going back to this example where we have this, for example, this multidimensional table. Now, how do I say expand row, right? I mean, this is how do I click this caret? And the answer of this is, sadly enough, that this is where we encounter the limits of this language. And anything I would recommend, on these complex table is to actually go through and, model this with its own custom actions, ideally with an interface that helps you to find these easily, right? So that you, for example, that users can find very simply like these actions that are available for modeling this functionality. So even things like selecting the table, again, we won't have in our screen here a UI table at all. We will completely rely on custom actions, and that means all the actions that you want to perform, input actions as well as verification actions, need to be fully user-defined. And this is just some samples of what you may want to do, but again, it all depends on what you actually need, right? So for your modeling, like what is the functionality that you're testing that you need to verify, and for that you need to define good quality custom actions. And how exactly you do that, we discussed in our previous video in part 4. So if you have not seen it, immediately go and see it because it has some very important information. And with that, we're already at the end. And I want to thank everybody for their attention. Take your time modeling with UI tables. It is a little bit more advanced concept, so maybe do a simple practice model. Remember the key points here, always abstract. Don't model the full data. Don't add all the data. Only model the data that should be included. This is very important. Don't model every column unless you really, really, really need to verify it. And yes, we talked about the GUI actions, and right, remember custom action information is also an advanced topic, so make sure that you, or at least get a review, even not ask a model expert to create them for you and leverage them via SD libraries. With that, I want to thank everybody for their attention and see you in the next video.